Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns, those anti-federalists. Yes, they did. They absolutely got it right. And we're here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty does work with you and for you. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. I'm sorry, I'm chuckling there a little bit about that, because as I always think about the anti-federalists getting it right, man, were they ever so correct. We're seeing that playing out all the time. And this week even more so. I can't say even more so, but consistently, they were just spot on when it came to the whole idea of how the Constitution could be corrupted. And, I have to admit, quite frankly, that Madison was pretty much right in so many different ways. He's a very smart guy. I really like Madison a lot. And going through the Federalist Papers themselves, which, so let's stop a second. All right, I'm going to stop a second, and we have to make this clarification. You see, I have in so many different ways, I love what the Federalist Society does. I love the fact that we have people that are looking at being strict constructionist, but there's so much there in the terminology, and again, terminology is very, very important. But there's so much there that bothers me in some regards, and I really appreciate, former Justice Scalia and what he had to say. But with so many, I understand, but so many say that we cannot understand original intent. And I find that just so hard to believe, so hard to swallow, because as I read Madison, and I read just what, is in the Federalist Papers, let alone the Anti-Federalist Papers, and we're going to talk about Madison here in the Federalist Papers in a little bit. But when you take and you look just at the Federalist Papers, and granted that for those first number of years, those that were implementing the Constitution did not have the advantage of either Madison's notes nor Yates' notes of what actually happened in the convention. But they did have the expression of what those gentlemen who participated had to say in both the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Papers, as well as all of the other writings that surrounded the constitutional period, including those of the founders, direct letters, mail, all of the various things that they were doing just in their private lives. So as you have to take into consideration, as I turn down my phone, as you take into consideration what people were saying, what they were thinking, what they were doing, and what the intent for an operational form of government should and could and should be, I think it's very, very clear in their writings as to intent. And when we take and we just try and look at the strict words of things, that is pretty darn good. The law is the law. And interpretation of the law has to be on something. And I understand, especially to obviate the evil ones, the liberals, the communists, the socialists, the humanists, that the idea is to utilize a strict constructional language perspective and say that that's the foundational basis upon which you interpret Constitution and law. I can appreciate that. I really do. But yet, if you got a question of intent, then what you do is you send it back to the lawmakers. And in the sense that we can't query those that wrote the Constitution personally today, therefore, no different than if the court if it had any form of true process, instead of making decisions on things, would actually say, you know what, Congress, send it back to you. We can't rule on this because it's inconclusive based on what you wrote. And not only that, you wrote it so poorly, what you did is you turned it over to some bureaucratic agency to interpret according to their insanity. And therefore, what's happening in the bureaucracy is so different than what you may have intended by law. So your unintended consequences are that which is becoming rules and regulations. So how can the court actually look at the law when it's taking and trying to discern lawsuits that are based on the implementation by bureaucratic bodies? That's the complexity, ladies and gentlemen, of what we have going on. That is the complexity of what we see happening with DACA, what we see happening with tax reform, what we see happening in every aspect of everything that is going on in Congress and in governance, not only at the federal level, but also at the states levels in so many ways. Also, even down to the county level. I was talking to a county commissioner this past week, and surprisingly, he goes that there was a rule, a regulation, if you will, a rule on a certain issue that the former commissioners put into place was never fully implemented, and now somebody wanted to implement it. And it was like, oh, really? Well, where'd that come from? And so the commissioners had to take a look at this rule, this regulation, a regulation that was impacting property rights. And this regulation that was impacting property rights was severe, okay? But it was put in to effect by a group of commissioners, and then the rulemaking component from what the commissioners said into, and it's like, wait a minute, now we're impacting property rights. And it's like, really? Is that a good rule? Is that a good regulation? And it was obviously not, because of the cost. So it happens at the county level as much as it happens at the federal level, that rules and regulations become something that is egregious in government. And it brought me to interesting. So this is what's really interesting, is that, you take and you read something one place, but when that same thing comes up in multiple and diverse writings, it's like, wow, that's really meaningful. So there were some things that I was reading in the Old Testament this past week, in that it was talking about, yes, that God rules, and that what does it mean for implementation within civil society? How does that become effective? And it's there. It's in a number of different places in the Old Testament. It's in Jeremiah, and it's even in Psalms. It's all over the place. And interestingly enough, people don't want to admit it, it's also in the New Testament. And Jesus talks about it himself. And then as it goes through further, even Paul has some commentary around that as well, in that, you have to look at that government is, based on God's principles. But I was going through, as I said earlier, we were going to talk about Madison, and we were going to talk about some things going on in the Federalist Papers. It was in here, is Federalist number 43. And it goes through these different principles and precepts that were being discussed in here. And it came up with the end after these 9 points in 43 to summarize into 2 questions. And I want to focus from those 2 questions into the first answer, and then Samuel Adams, a reference as well into that. So after all of these questions and these points of discussion that were going on in 43, he asks this. He says, two questions of very delicate nature present themselves on this occasion. One, on what principle the Confederation, which stands in the solemn form of a compact among the states, can be superseded without the unanimous consent of the parties to it? Interesting. Good question. Two, what relation is to subsist between the 9 or more states ratifying the Constitution and the remaining few who do not become parties to it? All right. Getting right down to the, kind of the meat of the whole discussion there at the beginning before it jumps into more. So here's his answer. He says, the first question is answered at once by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects at which all political institutions aim and to which all institutions must be sacrificed. Perhaps also an answer may be found without searching beyond the principles of the compact itself. So, without going any further, I think it's very interesting that here Madison makes it very, very clear that to answer the question of relationship of a compact, that relationship, as I talk about in my book, which it's done, the book is done, it's in for its final edits now, but in there I start with not just compact, but I start with covenant. So when we look at that, he talks about this whole idea of the great principle of self-preservation. So we go all the way back into the understanding that if you were the only person on earth, you would not have to worry about any government, because the only government you would have to worry about is that which would be between you and God to self-govern. Other than that, I guess you could go berserk if you wanted to, but I think you'd find that rather not what you wanted to do. You'd want to establish some principles and values for yourself. But he takes that to the next component, and what he says is that to have that great principle of self-preservation is to then what? Transcend the laws of nature and of nature's God. Ties it all back together. Ties it absolutely together. So those are the underlying principles that he talks to. So when we talk about and refer, and we're going to get to Sam Adams in the next segment, but when we talk about and we refer to this whole idea of original intent, I think we can start with the principles, because all government, every aspect of it, has to have some fundamental principles upon which it is built. And to be able to understand constitutionalism, and as he's talking about here in 40 alone, or 40 through 43 in particular, is what those underlying principles are for good governance. How does it work? And he brings it back to those that are of self-preservation, that which is of nature and nature's God. And if we understand natural law always refers back to God's law, because the principles upon which everyone believed at this period of time, except the emerging humanist there in Europe, were the fact, and even they referred to God to some effect, and that there was this tie between nature and creation and all of that being together. But for America in particular, the core principle of it is nature, which natural law was that given by God because he put creation into motion, and then by God's law. The two go hand in hand. So I think as the courts then were to look at how to dissect, interpret the language of the Constitution and of law itself, would be to derive it from the principles upon which it is built. And those are the things that are key to why Samuel Adams is returned, and definitely why those anti-federalists are absolutely right, because they talk about those principles specifically. Come on back for the next segment. We'll see you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this next segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Yes, those anti-federalists absolutely got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty does work for you. And I'm so delighted that you're back again with me. And here we are into almost halfway through January. Isn't that amazing? The 13th already? My goodness, I don't know about you, but it's been some real interesting weather here in Northeast Ohio. I mean, at our home, we've had a good, 18, 20, 24 inches of snow, and that nice chilly -5 degrees that, just kind of, anyway, I'm sure everybody here across the country and in those other eastern markets in particular, you've had some nice cold spells as well, all the way down into Florida. But one of the things that, talking about those eastern markets in particular, you know what, you folks, I sure do hope that as you listen, you do go to Liberty Works Radio Network and that you are taking and looking at that donate button. This is all about you. It is all about you taking care of the network and participating. And it's always about how we participate with our sacred honor, how we participate with our lives, and yes, even our fortunes. So as you can, and as it makes sense for you, which I hope it makes a lot of sense, is that you take the time to hit that donate button and participate here with the network. And that's exactly what the founders did. They participated. And we as citizens is what we are called to do, is to participate in our governance, be it local or be it if we're called onto that national scene. But no matter what, we drive back to what we were talking about in that last segment, is that here we had Madison in Federalist number 43 that was defining what was going on inside the Articles of Confederation. Inside that whole component, even around taxation, and that there were things that people were already assenting to within the Articles of Confederation, and the intent within the context of the Constitution was to clarify those and, as they said, give them energy. And giving them energy meant that in the qualification that they would also be able to exercise them in ways that the Confederation wasn't, because the body politic was not being sufficient to take and, make it mean something. And he qualifies in 43 as well, the whole idea that, yes, there are components of even the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, that not only allowed the states to act as independents and act upon the Confederation Act upon the states, but there were also components upon which the Confederation acted, and the Articles of Confederation acted upon individuals. And they were specific. And to the extent that Madison was saying in 43 that those same means upon which the Confederation was already acting on the individual, including taxation at the Postal Service in particular, imagine that, is that so too that the Constitution then would basically do the same thing, that it would allow the states their already existing rights, as well as the individual existing rights that were secured by what we believe that God-given rights are, but it would also allow for the more specific implementation so that there was a greater degree of continuity in how the federal government would operate. So that brings me back to the understanding and where I was talking about what does it mean to interpret the Constitution, interpret law, how the courts and the judges and those that would sit in those areas look at what that all meant. And out of 43, if you'll recall, I quoted the answer to question number 1 here. On what principle the Confederation, which stands in the solemn form of a compact among the states, can be superseded without the unanimous consent of the parties to it? And remember, to do any changes in the Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous. And the question was, well, how can you ratify the Constitution with only 9 of 13 states, which was obviously not unanimous? To which he answers the first question in this way. He says that it's at once by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects at which all political institutions aim, and to all such institutions must be sacrificed. Now, here, just is very, very clear on what that is, and as I explained in the last segment, and those that are interested in the last segment will be able to go to the archives of the program at SamuelAdamsReturns.net to find those archives. So you'll be able to go to the Samuel Adams Returns channel on YouTube and watch the program and the archive. But this was written in, the Federalist Papers were written in when? That whole argument between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were right after the Constitutional Convention, and that was, 1787. So that's primarily when all of this was going on, 77, 78, all of that. I'm sorry, yes. It's 87. Isn't it? 1787? Come on, folks, wake up. You're getting the dates wrong. Anyway, let's look at that. But where I wanted to take you, don't let me slip up on those dates, Thank you, Kathy, for giving me that look over there. But I appreciate that. But let's take this back another period of time. Let's take this back from, instead of 1787, let's take this all the way to the time frame of 1768. So let's say, for argument's sake, that Madison wrote this 43, and I don't have the exact date in front of me, but say he wrote 43 in the January, February of 1788. Okay, go 20 years back. So let me remind you of these words from Madison. He says here once again that the first question can be answered by the recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, and declares the safety and happiness of society and the objects at which all political institutions aim. Okay? Now you got that. All right? Now let's jump 20 years backwards. 20 years backwards. 1768. Samuel Adams is writing. Okay? He is writing here an article called Vindex, article signed Vindex. And he puts this in the Boston Gazette in December. Wow. December of 1768. And he's talking about standing armies, and if they're raised, that never done in time of peace. And that with the Parliament doing it, it's against the law. Okay. Having a standing army in a time of peace. So that was always a contention anyway of the anti-federalists on the issue of having standing armies, and that's why the militias were always important, and that's why the Second Amendment was important, because the militias were called up from you and me, individual citizens, to take and then be part of the militia. There wasn't even a National Guard, okay? It was, hey, folks, time to do your duty. We need to go do these things, all right? We need to go take care of the frontier. We need to fight the war of 1812 as that came about, so on and so forth. So the whole idea of a standing army, it's a waste of money, quite frankly, even today, in my opinion. You know what? I do believe. I'm going off a track here and down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I'm going to tell you straight up. I really do believe, no different than the Swiss, that every citizen should have every capacity to be ready to engage the enemy domestically, and if necessary, called up to go do that elsewhere. Geez, wouldn't that be a whole lot different if we didn't have a standing army to be able to deploy all the time and shove our young men and women into harm's way because there was a standing army? I think the citizenry would have a whole different perspective and point of view on what is just war. And instead of the demagogues and the neoconservatives and all of those that go out for these globalistic insanities, that you and I would have a better determination through our elected officials as to why we would want to engage in some kind of insanity. But it goes to a lot of what has happened over the last 100 years of, you know what, let somebody else do it. So, you know what, well, yeah, we'll sacrifice our kids, because they're doing it and I don't have to. Or, you could take that for the pinko commies. Oh yeah, let all those people that go into the military, let them go die on the battlefield for us. Oh, really? Come on. I think that maybe if you had the appropriate weaponry in your house and you knew that you were going to be called to service as necessary to protect the homeland as well as possibly engage somewhere else, you'd be thinking a little bit more about what just war theory is and what just wars are and how we should spend our money instead of some military machine. It's kind of an idea to think about, because Sam Adams says this. He says that in time of peace, to have a standing army is against the law in England. So this is a declaration of the right of every British subject, solemnly recognized by the Parliament immediately after the Glorious Revolution by William III. It stands recorded as one of the first things done after that friend to the common rights of mankind, that great deliverer of the nation from popery and slavery, and his royal consort were fixed on the throne, going back to William III. When the Constitution was again restored and settled on its own basis, which indeed is the only true basis of all government, the laws of God and nature. Wait a minute. That kind of sounds like in the other direction of what Madison was saying, but here it is that the basis, the only true basis of all government, the laws of God and nature. For government is an ordinance of heaven designed by the all-benevolent Creator for the general happiness of his rational creature, man. Geez, here's Sam Adams almost preaching, what it is, not just for government, but the fact that we have a benevolent, all-benevolent Creator, and that government is his ordinance. You know what? We're going to kind of touch on that as we get ready for the next segment here shortly. But the reality is this is why we have the problems we have, and we have the evils we have of people that get elected in their evilness, is because the churches haven't been teaching for a long period of time that government is an ordinance of heaven. And not only that, it is because of the all-benevolent Creator, and it's for our general happiness. And everything that Paul talks about in Romans is, in fact, because the powers should be for the good and maintaining the peace. But, I've talked about that in some other past programs, and we'll be elaborating on it. But you know what? It's here. It's in the Federalist Papers, and it goes hand in hand. The principles of government upon which you interpret the Constitution and law. And you determine that accordingly by the basis of God's law as well as the laws of nature, which are God-given. So we have to consider those very, very seriously. And I think we have to teach them and make sure that we instruct folks in them, because Sam Adams, he got it right, obviously. And so did those anti-federalists. And come on back in the next segment when we talk about this a little bit more. And you know what? Falling stars. Falling stars. See you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, yes, they did. They did absolutely got it right. And you know what? In this last segment for today, we're going to talk about a little bit, wrapping around what I just finished up in the last segment, is that Sam Adams was very, very clear. And he brings it out in so many writings. That's why I laugh at all of these other modern writers, you know, saying Sam Adams was a drunkard and all of this, because I'll tell you, everything I read in his personal writings, Sam Adams was a very solid believer in Christ, in the Bible, in Reformation truth, in government designed by God, and how we should live before him for his glory, and that government should function according to what God even talks about in Psalms, and he talks about in Ezekiel, and he talks about in Jeremiah, is that government is supposed to operate for the glory of God, and that people, you know, we're not talking about, and I was just reading some more by Gary North here the other day, and one of the things that he and even Rushdoony were saying, and I heard a talk by Rushdoony that was last night that I listened to, part of a radio program he did a number of years ago. And one of the things he was talking about is, you know, in this world, there's no way that you can impose a theocracy. There's no way that constitutionally a theocracy is something that we can push down on people. And that's been tried before. That was tried during the whole period of the Holy Roman Empire and all of that, that everybody had to be Catholic, that they had to be this. And then in the opposite is that we saw theocracy even come during as some of the English kings, where everybody had to be Protestant or whatever, you know, so there was this contention back and forth. And I think Rushdoony really laid it out very nicely, is that in America, under constitutionalism that we have, we cannot have a theocracy. But what we should have is what exactly we have Madison talking about there in the Federalist number 43. We have Sam Adams writing about basically 20 years prior, is the fact that if you have, and then Madison and John Adams said, if you have a moral and virtuous people, that then you can have the principles of good governance. You can look at, how do you stop evil? How do you stop immorality? By making the appropriate laws. So today, what we have and what we're seeing over and over in our court system and judicial system and the legal system is immorality. And the question becomes, can you legislate immorality? Well, yes, absolutely you can. Can you legislate it in American constitutionalism? Yes, absolutely. We're supposed to stop evil. We're supposed to have laws that take and are good for people. Are people going to do evil outside of law? They always have, you know. And unless a person takes and is called and understands that calling of God to himself through Jesus Christ, you're only going to do what you're going to do. It goes back to the whole idea of what, you know, Madison talked about, Sam Adams talks about, a lot of the other founders talk about, Montesquieu talks about. I was just reading once again in de Tocqueville, is that people are people. We're sinful, okay? But the idea of government is for that general welfare, that general good. And what we're seeing happen too often in America right now is that the catering to the evil, the catering to evil, the catering to immorality at the sacrifice of the greater good. So when you take and you have just a minority of people whose values and principles are contrary to the general population, to the general culture, you know what? I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sorry. But the fact and reality is they're the minority, and if they don't like the way the rest of culture and society is designed and the way that culture and society wants to live in morality and lawfulness, go somewhere else. Go somewhere where that is accepted. That's exactly what constitutionalism allows for. That's what, in fact, federalism allows for. So all the perversion, all of the insanities, if you will, because what's uncommon for humanity are those that are the insanities, which California is the prime, example of. If you want to believe what they believe, move to California, and you can believe all that they believe, or go to a place in the United States that is something that you want to participate in. Do not try to affect that insanity, because it's an infection, it's a disease. And Madison talks about it. Sam Adams talks about it. The founders talk about it. So when we talk about, can you interpret original intent, the answer is absolutely yes. I hope any of you young people that are out there, and if there's any young people that actually listen to this, my hope is that you get this clear understanding, is that you can, and there can be, communities, counties, and states that are of a moral and virtuous society. And it's all right under not only state constitutions, but it's all right under the national constitution. The perversions that have happened in the courts are because the courts and the judges that end up on the court are people that prefer to live within their sinful nature. They do not want to understand the laws of nature and of nature's God. Okay? It's that simple. So what does that mean for a falling star? Who am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about, unfortunately, a gentleman that helped Donald Trump get elected, Mr. Steve Bannon. Well, welcome back after a quick little glitch, but you didn't know that we were going away, those that are on the radio, but those that are watching here on YouTube, yes, we had a little bit of a technical glitch. The microphone ran out of battery, but that happens. That's technology. And as we take and consider what I was talking about as we made this glitch transition, that being the falling star being Steve Bannon. We see that in humanity so many different times. There are those people that just rise up to the top for whatever reasons, and although they may have some sense of principles, it goes to what the anti-federalist talked about, and what Scripture talks about, quite frankly, is that if our egos get in the way some way or another, a lot of other things happen. Or it could be that there are those that are the designing men and women, those that are against the values, principles, and truths that we hold dear, that then will manipulate everything else around so as to take and impact all the good that somebody might be able to do. A whole combination of things. That's just human nature, all of humanity, and that's why I've always talked about it, and I talked about it earlier in the segment, is that you know what? The Anti-Federalists looked at humanity and said, and looked at what was happening from a constitutional perspective and said, and contrary to the Federalists, said that man's sinful. And based on that nature of mankind, then the potentials for our self-governance not only to fall apart, but for our constitutional form of government to fall apart. So as we continue to consider what it means to interpret that being the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, it's reading the founders, both the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, all the various works. And I know everybody works a lot. You don't have a lot of time to do that. Well, that's why I'm here. That's why this program is here. So that we can bring you that reflection in the mirrors of history so that, you know what, I'm going to come straight from this. Yeah, I'm going to give you my commentary along with it, but that commentary is well read and studied both from the foundational aspects of the Reformation, our founding fathers, and what were these guys that framed the Constitution talking about? And as we kind of look at wrapping up the program today, I kind of want to drop back, not just what Sam Adams had to say, but I want to just use Madison out of 43, what he said out of number 43, Federalist number 43. That being very, very simply, when he was going through those various questions on, what were the principles in the Confederation that stood solemn as a compact or covenant within the states, he drove the answer to, once again, I'm going to read it. The first question is answered at once by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation. So when we start thinking about all this immigration and all of those types of issues, it is about the self-preservation of America. Not just our own self-preservation, which means where's your job? How is it with your local government? Where are you being taxed? How much are you being taxed? That's all part of self-preservation. So he says that all drives to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects at which all political institutions aim and to which all institutions must be sacrificed. Ladies and gentlemen, if the institutions that we have, if the bureaucracies that we have are not fulfilling these first principles of government that Madison was talking about. So when you talk about the judicial review and you talk about all these, I'll call them what they are, communist judges that are out there that are trying to bring in all sorts of evils, then I'm telling you straight up, they are violating the first principles of governance by which Madison was writing right here in the Federalist Papers, and in Federalist number 43 in particular, in driving that point home. I cannot read it enough to you to drive this point home, that it's the transcendent law of nature and nature's God. And nature's God is the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, and which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the object at which all political institutions aim. You get that? Safety and happiness. And the happiness doesn't mean la 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 happiness. Happiness means that you're secured in your property, that you have the ability to work, that you have the ability to worship in the Christian faith, and that is secured. And the safety means that, yeah, we have borders. We vet the people that come into this country. I've talked about immigration before, and the reality is, in fact, that it is all established for developing a nation based on those that want to come here and work. Did we take and we bring in a lot of folks that had a lot of different problems over the ages? Yeah, sure. We did some of that. But the fact and reality is that, you know what? The founders intended for the safety of we the people. That's why you formed government in the first place. Those are the first principles upon which, like I said at the very beginning of this program, if you lived on an island all by yourself, you know what? You're free to do whatever you want to do. If you lived on that island, you're free to associate with any bird, reptile, whatever, however you want to call them, your friend and associate. But when you start interacting with other human beings, you have to come to a determination that you are interested in your personal safety, security, and best interest, as well as theirs. And then if there's others out there, now you want to formulate that together a little bit more. Ladies and gentlemen, we got to keep coming back to the first principles of governance. And that's what we're going to continue to do throughout this year. Bring that to fruition. And so I'm so delighted that you have been here for the last 3 years with Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it right. And we'll be back next week here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty works for you.